A bomb being prepared on the back of a truck. The target, a nearby Syrian government checkpoint at the entrance of the city of Aleppo. This video was shot by reporters for the New York Times, who spent 5 days with a group that fights under the banner of the Free Syrian Army. The group call themselves the Lions of Tawhid and say they'll accept nothing less than the end of the regime of President Bashar al-Assad. This 52-man unit is led by a former accountant and is becoming increasingly organised as the bloody battle for the city of Aleppo continues. They've taken over the abandoned flat of a police captain loyal to the regime, who's left his personal possessions behind. As well as the family photos, they're also enjoying the luxuries he once had. At their base, the group have a prisoner. They say he's a member of the C.I.A militia, which is loyal to the government, and that he's confessed to carrying out killings. He bears the bruises of a beating, it's said, from those who'd held him before tonight. The rebels appear to be treating him well, offering him cigarettes and a shower, and he's told that he'll be released as part of a prisoner exchange. Blindfolded, he's driven towards the city. He's told all he'll have to do is drive the truck towards a government checkpoint. What he doesn't know is the truck is the one that's been rigged with a 300-kilo bomb. The rebel fighters intend to detonate it remotely when he approaches the checkpoint. He's being tricked into being an unwitting suicide bomber. But the fighters return disappointed. When they pressed the detonator, the bomb failed to explode. The New York Times journalists who filmed all of this say that at the time they were not aware of the rebels' intentions. Using prisoners as suicide bombers would certainly be considered a war crime. And whilst those opposing President Assad have said they respect the rights of prisoners, this video shows what some rebel fighters are willing to do. Gordon Carrera, BBC News.
It's a life of fear, of insecurity, and of lack of future. We are divided like a kind of tumors. In every part, we have armed people coming and forcing civilians to live following their orders. And what they want is to paralyze civilian life. So there is no more shops. If you need something, you can't find a worker. And of course, you don't have nutrition, you don't have alimentation, lack of food, lack of fuel, lack of electricity. And this fear, because you don't know when it will be your turn to be considered as a collaborator. They strive what's so-called for freedom and democracy. I am not Syrian, but I have been living in Syria for today almost 20 years. Syria was under a kind of totalitarian regime, but not in only a way, a repressive way, but it was that all the decision would be taken by few persons. But there was security, there was food, education, and people were living, of course, not in a kind of that they would say they're thinking in a loud voice. Now, this totalitarianism is not good and it's obsolete. But if the armed insurrection is implementing another totalitarianism, which is maybe worse, because there is blood, they can behead you, they can cut your, last week in our village, they cut the fingers of a so-called collaborator who is native from the village. Then they behead him, and they cut him in piece, and they left him in the street where even children would see it. So this kind of acts of atrocities cannot help people to really believe that what is happening is a strive for freedom.
Hello everyone, welcome to GGN. Today's Thursday, August 23rd, 2012. I'm Darko. All the headlines and links will be posted in YouTube's video description, so check them out if you like. First article I have up is Syrian insurgents draft more al-Qaeda militants amid raging clashes. It says here that among the foreign nationals fighting alongside them against the Syrian government are militants known to be linked with al-Qaeda terrorists. Damascus has already blamed foreign-backed insurgents and infiltrators for an almost 18-month-long deadly violence in the country, which has claimed the lives of many people, including large numbers of army and security personnel. Robert Fisk says rebel army, they're a gang of foreigners. Our writer hears the Syrian forces' justification for a battle that is tearing apart one of the world's oldest cities, talking about Aleppo. So in the article or interview, the writer went on to talk about this Major Samar, who spoke excellent English. I guess he was part of the Syrian army. He said the borders need to be closed. He said the borders with Turkey are a big problem and that the leader of Turkey, Erdogan, whatever, is against Syria. And they were talking about religion. He said, Islam comes from this land, Christians come from this land, Jews come from this land. This is why it is our duty to protect this land. He said, several soldiers believe the rebels were trying to convert Christians of Aleppo a peaceful people. They kept calling them, and there was a popular story doing the rounds yesterday of a Christian storekeeper who was forced to wear Muslim clothing and announce his own conversion in front of a video camera. And following on that, Uzbeks joined Syrian guerrilla fighters, says The Guardian. So scores of foreign jihadists have crossed into Syria from Turkey in the past few weeks, some of them telling Syrians they are planning to travel to Aleppo to join the battle against regime troops. It goes in here and says there have been Tunisians, men from Uzbekistan too, and from Pakistan, said the smuggler. They say the Syrians are brothers and they are going to help them. Some of the new arrivals had told local police they also try to connect with a smaller number of homegrown Syrian groups in the country who at least partly share their ideology and who fought against U.S. forces in Iraq. Syria says West looking for an excuse to send in troops. This is from August 21st. They said here that the West is looking for an excuse for military intervention in his country, a move that he says would be impossible. Well, I don't know about that if they send special forces. But it says here it would lead to a wider war in the Middle East, which that part would be right. So I guess they would be right, because the U.S. has plans in place to secure Syria chemical weapons, and it's mostly Israel. They're the ones that are making a big hoopla about it because they're so close, which, they have a legitimate concern. But at the same time, it's, the U.S. is just doing their dirty work for them. It says contingency plans call for sending U.S. special forces into Syria to protect or destroy any unguarded stockpiles to keep them from militants. So this is the crazy part. They say they don't want them to get in the hands of militants, i.e. the rebel terrorists, al-Qaeda, that they're supporting. And it says here, President Obama warned this week that any effort by Assad to move or use his arsenal of chemical munitions in the country's conflict would cross a red line, implying it could prompt swift U.S. intervention. So if the militants try to get a hold of these things and they try to move them, well, then that's basically going to allow them to go in there and intervene, as if they haven't already. But another thing, too, is, remember I've covered this before about Israel actually they're actually aiding the rebels to find these chemical weapons. Israel is, with their reconnaissance and that. So to talk about irony, you have Iraq man pleads guilty in Kentucky terror case. So this didn't make all the headlines. But it says an Iraqi man charged in Kentucky with supporting terrorism in his native country pleaded guilty just hours after a judge was told the government can prove he worked with insurgents to kill U.S. troops. So these are the same people that the U.S. is now funding, right, in Syria. And they may not be killing troops, but they're killing civilians. It says here, exclusive, Obama authorized the secret U.S. support for Syrian rebels. So Obama is authorizing support for the same people that were killing troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. C.I.A. said to aid in steering arms to Syrian opposition, so helping to get arms to fight the Syrian government. C.I.A. is also smuggling 14 Stinger missiles into Syria so that the same people that killed soldiers in Iraq can take out the Syrian government. Is U.S. aid to Syrian rebels helping al-Qaeda? Well, of course. Secret assistance to rebel groups may be winding up in the hands of America's greatest enemies. And remember this, top Libyan rebel leader had deep al-Qaeda ties, and they knew that as they were funding these Libyan rebels. A lot of parallels with Libya too, because Libya had the same issue with medical issues. Same thing with Syria, and now same thing with Iran. They're running out of medical stuff that they need and supplies because of sanctions and all that, and what they're doing. And these rebels that they're funding, the terrorists, are going through and they're looting and they're destroying everything, and they're putting them back into the dark ages. Gaddafi's son faces hanging if found guilty from August 20th. So, yep, that's right. It says here that they said here that, yeah, independent militia caught him trying to escape across the desert last November. And the truth is that they were carrying a white flag. They were trying to move through the desert. But when I was a U.S. guided drone that led the rebels to them, and they had a white flag flying, and they shot him. And they killed a bunch of people, and they took him, and they actually tricked him. That was the thing. They actually tricked him, the rebels, into going with them. So, really, really slick. Just like how you saw in that first video where they almost had that guy becoming a suicide bomber. But God willing, it didn't work, right? God willing. Talking about human rights, right? Like I've already mentioned this before, there was a lot of things that were in Libya as far as what the money that they got from their oil reserves was going towards the people. So, I mean, they actually were for human rights. But you see, Amnesty International welcomes the ICC, International Criminal Court decision on Saif Islam al-Gaddafi, calls on Libya to comply, which they have because it's a puppet government. It says here, Amnesty International is U.S. State Department propaganda. It's run by the U.S. State Department, funded by convicted financial criminals, and threatens real human rights advocacy worldwide. And they're talking about, of course, in Russia, the feminist group, the Riot, with the goal of undermining the Russian government. And Suzanne Nozel, previously of the U.S. State Department, is now executive director of Amnesty International. So just to back up what I was saying, about these sanctions and what they're doing, Iran medics warn against deadly upshot of West sanctions, said although the West sanctions do not ban the sale of medicines to Iran, they block every financial route needed to obtain drugs for patients suffering from diseases like diabetes, kidney failure, hemophilia, multiple sclerosis, and leukemia. Then next up, Romney selling American blood to Zionist criminals, says Anna, by expressing support for an Israeli military strike against Iran. Says here, Gordon Duff said Romney was groveling to the organized crime groups operating through Israel's Likud party, dominated by the Koch brothers, American gasoline speculators, casino boss, and Rupert Murdoch. So Romney traveled to Israel on July 28th, says here, designed to shore up his foreign policy credentials abroad and woo the Jewish voters at home. He has found the mother of all causes, selling the promise of an American war fought by Americans, financed by Americans, American dead, American blood, American collapse, a war demanded by not Jews of the world, but by organized crime groups. But this woman says anti-Iran rhetoric reflects U.S.-Israel implosive crisis. So she's saying it is smoke and mirrors. She goes, all this constant threat of war is an effort to change the terms of the debate, seized back the limelight at a time when Israel and the U.S., there is a complete economic crisis. And she makes a good point. It says here, many in middle class say they are doing worse financially. It says here, a survey released Wednesday by researchers found that despite many challenges they face, the nation's lowest income individuals are nonetheless thankful they don't have to endure the unique hardships of the nation's long-suffering middle class. So the unrealistic expectations and false hope they experience must be unbearable, New Jersey hotel clerk told researchers, noting that while her $22,000 annual salary barely covers her rent and groceries each month, at least she doesn't operate under the flawed assumption that her situation will somehow improve. Remember George Carlin has said about the American dream, you have to be asleep to believe it. 2000s were lost decade for middle class, says household incomes net worth shriveled. I find that I'm running in place at best, and in some areas I'm probably slowly falling behind, says John Connor. And that's not John Connor from the Terminator. He's a garage owner in New Jersey. The 2000s were a lost decade for America's middle class that left them poorer and more pessimistic than the 10 years earlier, according to Pew Research Center. It says here that they fell from 61% and 71 to 51% today. It says half of those moved into the upper class bracket, which now controls more wealth than the middle class for the first time in 40 years. Join me in part 2 and we'll continue with the economy.